Welcome to Face to Face, connecting theater makers to the public, a program from the Legacy Theater and socialdistancetheater.org.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Face to Face. I'm Tess Adams, and today I have the pleasure of sitting down via Zoom with the current managing director of Westport Country Playhouse. He has worked with renowned regional theaters all over the country, including Marin Theater Company, Laguna Playhouse, Seattle Repertory Theater, Court Theater, Goodman Theater, and more. He holds an MFA in theater management from Yale School of Drama and an MBA from Yale School of Management. Please welcome Mr. Michael Barker. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Jess, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being a part of Face to Face. So I was really excited for our interview today because I've been interviewing predominantly performers, which I love doing, but I thought it might be interesting for our viewers to learn a little bit more about what actually goes into running a regional theater, especially at the scale and level of some of the places that you've worked, including Westport Country Playhouse. How would you define the primary responsibilities of being managing director?
Well, you intimated the truth of it is that I end up describing what I do a lot to people because people don't necessarily think of what I do. The regional theater model, as it's been since the 60s, is usually a dual leadership model, which is to say that there's an artistic director who is responsible for the mission side of the organization, and a managing director, which is what I am, or an executive director they're sometimes called, which is responsible for the institutional life of the theater. And there is often a lot of overlap between the two. Primarily, my job is about enabling the art. I do a lot of fundraising. I do a lot of sort of management of our staff and management of our facility through the staff. But primarily what I do is I work with Mark Lamos, my artistic director, to advocate for our audiences and to help position us to be able to produce the best art that we can produce.
And like you said, Mark Lamos is the artistic director. So one thing I wanted to ask you was how the responsibilities of your job differ from his.
So Mark is a director by training, and he is primarily known, I think, for his direction of opera and of Shakespeare, although he's directed all kinds of things. And so his way into the organization and where he provides most of his leadership is through the expression of the art, the mission expression of the organization. Where I lead primarily is in conversations about, our strategic placement in the competitive environment. Certainly talking about resources. Certainly talking about the way our trustees are in leadership and the way our senior staff and our staff more generally represent the Playhouse. But the division is it's mushy, right? I mean, I don't direct plays. That's not a skill that I have, but almost 100% of the organizational conversations that Mark and I have, you can't really tell where the art ends and where the institution begins, because there is no institution without the art, although I think the current moment is kind of the exception that's proving the rule. But there's just constant healthy push and pull, and what I talk about in terms of the way that we create art and the way that Mark talks about the way we create art, they're complementary, because he's talking about the thing itself and I'm talking about the space that it lives in.
So you started to get into the current situation that we're in, the pandemic, and I wanted to ask about your responsibilities changing and the shift in what you've had to program and be in charge of because of social distancing and attempting to still engage audiences and engage supporters and donors through content during this time.
I mean, I can answer it sort of two different ways. What we've had to do is maybe slightly different from the kind of leadership that we're looking to provide. So I think everybody in the field, I mean, it's like 98% or something of equity performers and stage managers are not employed doing theater right now. So clearly there's not a lot of that happening. We had a little bit of an advantage in that our season timing is different than a lot of the folks in the field, because we used to be a summer stock. So we start in April, and then we will have our season runs through November. So we originally went down to 3 shows, and then it became very clear that that was not going to be a probable outcome. And so we did end up postponing the entire season to next year, and was just having some conversations today about our plan B, C, D, and X for contingency planning around that. But in the meantime, we just, previous to the coronavirus shutting everything down and going to shelter in place, had hired a new education and community outreach director, which is part of our strategic plan. Jenny has been just amazing in terms of helping us fill up this space, which is not a space that we're expert in. We also made a call pretty early on in the pandemic that we would not be attempting to translate theater very much to this medium, which is not a decision that every organization has made. There are some financial reasons that it's very costly, and there was a thing in the Times the other day about to put up these recorded productions, of which we have a few. We also, and after some pretty intensive discussions, I think that the consensus, although not the unanimous point of view of our senior staff, and particularly Mark, is that this doesn't capture that. I was actually talking specifically about Hamilton earlier, and just having seen it live, and I know not everybody can, it just isn't nearly the same thing. And they're both wonderful, but it's not nearly the same thing. So a lot of what we've been doing in this space has been more outreach and education focused. We did a musical theater, sort of a master class with Kelly O'Hara, who lives in Weston and is a friend of the theater, and she's going to be doing some other stuff with us. And then we're doing a small, sort of engagement arts camp for kids with Long Wharf and with the Schubert up in New Haven. But, most of what's happening now is planning to be back in person next year, almost a year from now.
So backtracking a bit to your career and kind of your trajectory, you received your BA from Carleton College in theater arts and Japanese, which is really interesting. And then you interned for Goodman Theater after college, but you were in marketing PR, is that correct?
Yeah, so I moved to Chicago to be an improviser. I went to Improv Olympic in Second City and was training to do a long form improvisation and sketch comedy, which I did for about 5 years while I was in Chicago. But at the same time, I was working in, my first real job out of college, I was working in sales, unrelated to theater. And I decided I didn't want to hate my job, even while I was pursuing things that were artistically interesting to me at the time. And happened to come upon the internship listing for the Goodman. And that was my first, speaking of people not knowing what I do for my work and having to explain it, it was my first experience ever encountering people who were not artists working in theaters. It just hadn't occurred to me for whatever reason that there were people that do this stuff. And, I had a little experience in marketing, and that allowed me entree at the Goodman. And I guess it seems like a straight line when you look back in the rearview mirror, but it sort of haven't looked back in terms of the field. I've been very lucky to continue to work in the field since.
So then you worked in the marketing departments of several theaters before getting your MBA and MFA, both from Yale. What made you decide to go to graduate school? And was that a combined degree program?
It is a joint degree program. I thought that people that went to grad school were making terrible life choices. And then my girlfriend at the time went to grad school in North Carolina for library science. And then I had a boss at Court, a woman named Dawn Helsing, who was the executive director there, who had been in the MFA program at the School of Drama. And she, within about 2 weeks of meeting me, was starting to try to push me out the door to do that. And it took her 2 years. But yeah, so I went to New Haven, enrolled in the MFA program, and that's a 3-year program. Well, I guess during COVID, it's going to be a 4-year program. But in any case, when I was there, it was 3 years, and you could add the MBA for only another year, and it just seemed if I could gain enrollment at SOM, I would also do that. So, and they're complementary.
Absolutely. And then after grad school, you went to California for a bit and worked for Laguna Playhouse as general manager, and then Marin Theater Company as managing director. So that's a bit different. I mean, it uses those marketing and PR skills that you had, but there's a lot more logistical use of logistical knowledge and running the operations side than some of the positions that you were in before. So
Yeah.
What made you interested in that shift?
Well, that was the reason to go to grad school. I didn't have any great love of arts marketing. It was just something I had some capability of doing, and I could do that instead of doing marketing for things that I didn't care about. But going to grad school was absolutely about becoming a managing director. The people whose jobs I wanted, Rock Schulfer, certainly Don Helsing, people I really admired in the field who were leading in the work that wasn't the artistic work, that was the administrative and management and leadership work. That was what I came out wanting to do. And my first job out of grad school, going for about 9 months because there was a mismatch in terms of expectations with the artistic director. But my first job was I was the managing director of a tiny little theater company called the Antias Company in Los Angeles. They've since moved to Glendale, but that's an ensemble company of about, I don't know, it's like 200 actors, mostly working TV and film. And so I've been able to do this since graduating, which has been just sort of amazingly lucky in many ways, as well as the plan.
Yeah, that's incredible. So in 2016, you became managing director of Westport Country Playhouse. And in 2005, the Playhouse was totally refurbished and renovated. And then in 2009, Mark Lamos was named artistic director. So I was reading a bit about Mark's vision for Westbrook Country Playhouse, and he talked about there being a renewed commitment to the greatest variety of entertainment. Coming into the company in 2016, were you aware of the history of the company and how it was situated in kind of this Northeast regional theater world? Did you know how it sort of changed and evolved over the years?
No. So I spent 4 years in New Haven at Yale, and I don't know this for certain, I think I came down to the Playhouse campus once because my wife, who's a costume designer, was assisting on a show. That's not confirmed. But I mean, frankly, the Westport Country Playhouse is not to some great extent thought about in the national conversation. And this belies, I mean, what you're indicating is the 90-year history, starting with the Theater Guild and going all the way up through clearly, Joanne Woodward's involvement and the current moment and the kind of high quality productions that we produce. But no, when the headhunter called me up, it's a guy named Steve Albert, he said, have you ever thought about Westport Country Playhouse? You spent time in Connecticut. And I said, yeah, isn't that in the middle of a field somewhere? I mean, I just didn't know anything about it. But what I did know was that, or at least Steve informed me, was that Mark Lamos was there, and I am an enormous admirer of Mark's work and had been for some time. I always say to Mark, he can't hear me saying too many nice things about him or he'll get a big head, but he's truly one of the remaining titans from the first wave of artists from the 60s and 70s coming into the regional theater world, and his work at Hartford, where he won the regional theater Tony. It's an incredibly attractive person for someone like me who's, my background and my training is all about enabling great art, and to be able to be Mark Lamos's probably last managing director was just something that was incredibly compelling. And then after that, to become a little more educated about the history and to know sort of the place of this theater in the enormity of American theater, sort of overall. It's a blessing. It was just a very compelling place to make art, and since the refounding, sort of a renewed commitment to new work and a place that has resources and facilities that are unmatched in the regional theater. So a lot of advantages, but primarily I think the draw was Mark.
So when you stepped in, did you feel that shift, that kind of renewed commitment? You weren't there, of course, when it was like the renovated version reopening up, but did you see how those changes were attempting to be enacted?
Artistically? Well, I mean, certainly every artistic director brings their own mark to an organization that they lead, and Mark has certainly done that. I mean, where we've really spent time, thinking about sort of the impression or the path that we want to follow was in this strategic planning process that we did over several years, and now we're in the middle of this 5-year plan, sort of third year. And part of that plan, there were sort of 4 pillars, but one of the main pillars of the plan was about a recommitment to new plays. And the thing about doing new plays at a place like the Playhouse is that it's complete. I mean, we think of sort of the new play development field as being really started maybe about 20 years ago, but over the course of the 90-year history of this theater, there was something like 48, 49 world premieres, something like 25 productions that transferred to New York, up to and including Harbor, which was only 4 or 5 years ago. So, it's just, for us, in terms of the recommitment to new work and sort of the focus on that in the center of our artistry, wasn't about doing something different or new. It was about sort of identifying that in our DNA and then saying that's the piece that we're going to spend our time on and spend our resources on.
So many celebrities have performed at Westport Country Playhouse, including Paul Newman, Liza Minnelli, Gene Wilder. It just goes on. And like you said, there's this 90-year history of being, close to New York City, attracts a lot of big name artists. What do you think is attractive about performing at the Playhouse and attracts that level of name coming in?
I mean, I think that there are 2 things at play, right? So one is that you're close enough to New York to commute, but you don't have to get written up in the New York Times. And I think that there's a huge value to that for producers especially, but also the stars, right? Because if you get a bad review in Westport, it doesn't necessarily stick to you if you're going to try to do it later in New York. So that's a big advantage that we have in terms of stuff that's sort of out of town tryout kind of things. We've not done any of that since I've been there, but we've gotten close enough where you kind of understand what the conversation is. More often, though, I mean, I think the way that we engage talent, nobody will turn down big stars if big stars want to do something you already want to do. The problem is that usually the big star comes with a big idea, and it is perhaps as rare as not that project isn't necessarily something you would do if whoever wasn't already attached to it. And we try not to let the tail wag the dog in that way. But I think the reason that, particularly actors and designers and directors will want to work with us is because, we take care of our freelance artists, or at least we try our best. And we try, particularly given that we're this strange commuting thing where people aren't coming up usually and staying for 8 weeks. They're coming up and they're going home to Brooklyn sometimes, or even sometimes Jersey in the evening. We try to make them feel, well taken care of when they're in Westport, and to make that experience both practically, which is actually really important, and artistically to make it fulfilling.
So hypothetically, next spring, um, in a world where there is a vaccine and we are attending live theater and producing live theater, do you see the information and kind of knowledge of virtual programming or whatever the Playhouse has learned through this time affecting operations in the future?
Oh, it can't not. The whole world is going to be different. I mean, I imagine, I mean, the most basic thing is I imagine we'll be doing more of this on the screens, even when we don't necessarily have to. We've had better attendance at board meetings in this period of time than we've ever had, because where else are they going to go, right? I mean, not so much now, but sort of 3 or 4 weeks ago when people were really, you know, locked down on the stay at home. But I think, I mean, the things that we miss, right, or it's exactly what you, I mean, you sort of prefaced with when there's a vaccine. We're going to figure out ways to do this, I think, even in the absence of a vaccine. And it may be that more stuff is outside. You know, it may be that there are certain rapid tests, or, I mean, I know temperature checks are kind of on the out now, but we're going to find a way to put people together, because there's just, I've been really reaffirmed and sort of thankful that people are reminding me of this, because I miss it. Just that there's nothing to replace that sitting elbow to elbow with someone, and they've got their stupid cell phone out over here and they're chewing gum over here, and the, you know, some of the most cathartic stuff in the world is happening up here, and it's brilliant. I mean, because that, you know, the distractions are part of it. You know, I referenced Hamilton, the capture, a little earlier, and my favorite part of it was when you would hear the crowd applaud or scream between numbers, because it reminded me that it's not just something happening on a soundstage, but things that happen on a soundstage look a lot better on these screens a lot of the time, right? So again, it gets back to that, the analog is not the same as the thing itself. But all that is to say, I think, you know, it's not a hypothetical. I mean, I'm in meeting after meeting after meeting now about contingency planning around how we will come back. And there's the plan A, that's all the things that you said, where we get into an actual theater and we see an actual show or, you know, play or musical, and we experience it sort of status quo ante. And there's everything in between zero, which is sort of where we are now, and that. Because I think ultimately, as long as we can keep people safe, the impulse to experience art collectively is too strong to deny.
Going off of that, is there anything else that you would add about what's next for the Playhouse, kind of both artistically and logistically?
Well, I mean, this was to have been a very cool season for us, and it will be a very cool season next year. I mean, a lot of what we're doing now, because I've been in the saddle for a few years, and Mark and I have gotten to know each other, and we work together pretty well, I think. So things like the Ain't Misbehavin' that we wanted to put up this year, that we'll still put up next year. What we did for that wasn't, we didn't say, oh, we're in love with Ain't Misbehavin', we'd love to do that play, although Mark really loves it. What we said was, you know, we've got this thing that isn't really doable anymore, because it's got a little minstrelsy and it's a little kind of old-fashioned, whatever. And we figured out, Mark really figured out, but I'm in total support of it, that we could hand this to an artist like Camille A. Brown, who could then explode it and make it new and make it way more interesting. And I feel that, and so that's happening there. It's sort of the same deal with Next to Normal with Marco Santana, where he's going to tell this story in a way that is reflective of the Latinx experience and mental health. And I think that's, you know, and I like that show and I like the songs, but I think it's way more interesting to do it that way than to do it just any old way. And so, you know, really what's been happening, and this has happened throughout Mark's career, certainly, but I think where the focus is how do we interface with those artists that are doing exciting work out in the world. And we have this great proximity to New York where we can use, and we use, you know, it's 99% of the hiring comes out of New York. So we have the best artistry in the English-speaking theater world at our doorstep. And how do we leverage that to to recreate old things and to make things new? And I think if we can do that consistently, 3 or 4 times out of 5 every year, then we'll probably be good.
Well, Michael, thank you so much. This was really insightful and interesting, and I am sure that our viewers are going to really enjoy learning about something that they may not know as much about, like you said. I also felt like that, learning that there were people in the arts who were not performers. And I think it's so important, the seasonal planning and logistics. I mean, it's just amazing how many people are employed in this world and in the entertainment industry. Thanks for being a part of Face to Face.
All right, thanks for having me. Art jobs are real jobs. Take care.
Thank you for joining us on Face to Face. We would like to thank our sponsors, Oak Tree Development and the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and Brad Ross for the themed music. You can follow us on legacytheaterct.org.